enormous pleasure to be invited to speak to you all today and to meet you. I don't believe I've met any or many of you, so it is so wonderful to always have an opportunity to have a conversation with new interlocutors. So first of all, in addition to my thanks to the organizers, to Chanel and Sinfree and Phoebe and the rest of you, I would like to apologize that I'm not going to give quite the talk that I had planned. I've had a bit of a family emergency over the last couple of weeks, and I'm a little bit distracted. So hopefully I'm going to be coherent. But I wanted instead to, instead of sort of stumbling through a brand new talk, I thought I would revisit something that I put together pre-pandemic that still feels to me very salient and very important at this present moment. Before the recording started, we were talking about Bolsonaro, and I know, with the midterm elections in the US, for those of you who are there's a lot of polarization in our world, and a lot of sense that it's very difficult to speak across divides that seem to be getting more and more entrenched. And so this talk is about the three things that I look at in my work: water, weather, and embodiment. But it turns towards poetry and towards the ocean as a place where we might be able to have a different conversation and perhaps to meet each other across difference. So I know that sounds a bit strange, but I'm going to stage a poetic encounter underneath the sea. So I'm going to share my screen. I just have a couple of slides. The talk is a little bit dense, so let me just share this. 1 second. So here, the talk is a little bit dense, so I've just put together a couple of slides that will show you the structure of the talk so that you sort of have something to hang on to as I'm speaking. And I'll read you the abstract for it as well, so you sort of have a roadmap to where I'm going to be going with this talk that's called The Weather Underwater: Race, Gender, and Climate Change at Sea. So in this talk, I draw on these three themes: water, weather, and embodiment, to discuss how environmental harm to oceans is connected to gender justice and racial justice, but not in simple ways, and certainly not by way of metaphor or analogy. And to make this argument, I begin by reading feminist Black studies scholar Christina Sharp's work, In the Wake, alongside lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich's 1971 poem, Diving into the Wreck, in order to propose this idea of the weather underwater as a question that gathers up both environmental and gender justice, but also the question of historical anti-Blackness that Christina Sharp writes about, and from which white feminism needs to learn from. To do so, in the end of the talk, turn to the book M Archive, a book of poetry by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And this last part of the paper stages this speculative meeting between Gumbs's narrator in M Archive and Adrienne Rich's diver in the depths of the ocean, in order to learn something from Black feminist poetics about what I'm calling an ethics of dissolution. So the talk has a prologue, which is the poem, and then it proceeds through 5 parts, beginning with Christina Sharp, talking about environmental problems in the ocean, moving towards Adrienne Rich and a reading of her poem, and then, as I said, meeting up with Alexis Pauline Gumbs in the depths of the sea. So I'm going to begin actually by reading the poem by Adrienne Rich. Diving into the Wreck. First, having read the Book of Myths and loaded the camera and checked the edge of the knife blade, I put on the body armor of black rubber, the absurd flippers, the grave and awkward mask. I'm having to do this not like Cousteau with his assiduous team aboard the sun-flooded schooner, but here alone. There is a ladder. The ladder is always there, hanging innocently close to the side of the schooner. We know what it is for, we who have used it. Otherwise, it is a piece of maritime floss, some sundry equipment. I go down rung after rung, and still the oxygen immerses me, the blue light, the clear atoms of our human air. I go down, my flippers cripple me, I crawl like an insect down the ladder, and there is no one to tell me where the ocean will begin. First, the air is blue, and then it is bluer, and then green, and then black. I am blacking out. Yet my mask is powerful. It pumps my blood with power. The sea is another story. The sea is not a question of power. I have to learn alone to turn my body without force in the deep element. And now it is easy to forget what I came for among so many who have always lived here, swaying their crenellated fans between the reefs, and besides, you breathe differently down here. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes, the words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. I stroke the beam of my lamp slowly along the flank of something more permanent than fish or weed, the thing I came for. The wreck and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself and not the myth. The drowned face always staring toward the sun, the evidence of damage worn by salt and sway into this threadbare beauty, the ribs of the disaster curving their assertion among the tentative haunters. This is the place, and I am here, the mermaid whose dark hair streams black, the mermaid man in his armored body. We circle silently about the wreck, we dive into the hold. I am she, I am he, whose drowned face sleeps with open eyes, whose breasts still bear the stress, whose silver, copper, vermeil cargo lies obscurely inside barrels, half wedged and left to rot. We are the half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course, the water-eaten log, the fouled compass. We are, I am, you are by cowardice or courage, the one who find our way back to this scene, carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear. So part one, the weather. As an external force that is also an embodied experience, weather imprints on us, enters us, and conditions our daily existence. Our armpits dampen in response to the heat. Our jaws and tongues stiffen in the biting cold. Like hail-damaged rooftops and sun-bleached laundry, our bodies bear the impressions of the weather world. We could say that the weather is the external conditions of our quotidian lives. Weather is felt in and as our bodies. But is weather only a meteorological phenomenon? Black studies and feminist scholar Christina Sharp suggests that weather is also anti-Blackness. She writes, "In what I am calling the weather, anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate." Sharp's chapter, The Weather, from her book In the Wake, specifically references the Middle Passage of Black slavery in the US, as well as its contemporary manifestations as deaths in custody and police killings. But her point is that climate cannot be reduced to an event or a set of events. Sharp's quarry is instead with, quote, the totality of the environments in which we struggle, the machines in which we live, what I am calling the weather, end quote. Weather is context and milieu, both pervasive and often unnoticed. There may be a temptation to read Sharp's work as a metaphor or analogy where anti-Blackness is like bad weather. Yet definitively separating social and cultural conditions from environmental ones is impossible. Meteorological conditions are only one of the conditions that structure our daily lives, only one of the atmospheres in which we live. Sharp also suggests that the weather of anti-Blackness manifests as, quote, archives of breathlessness, which is in no way metaphoric. Sharp points out that breathlessness as weather has long accompanied Black life, citing Frantz Fanon's understanding of the connection between the revolt and an inability to breathe, as well as Eric Garner's final words on a New York sidewalk almost a decade ago now, "I can't breathe." In this critical understanding of weather and breath, racism and colonialism are understood not only as discursive constructs, of course, but as material phenomena that imprint on bodies, just as weather does. Anti-Blackness as the total climate, like all weather, may manifest via various kinds of meteorological conditions, but these climates are all anthropogenic. We, by which I mean the differentiated we that gathers up different collectives and different contexts. We are the weather makers who channel power and violence into the air and who also can take this air away. Part 2, the weather underwater. Most humans probably imagine the weather as beginning at ground level and extending some meters upward. Weather is what and how we live in, but also where we live. Weather is habitat. We imagine weather as a human milieu, where for terrestrial mammals such as ourselves, weather could be constrained in a rather narrow zone of livability. We probably imagine weather primarily in or as the air we breathe. But what happens if we go deeper? After all, Sharp's In the Wake is also a book about the sea. It examines the maritime crossings of the Middle Passage, the hold of those slave ships and slaves discarded into the sea, refugee crossings and forensic oceanographic evidence of a sea that was made to hold on to violence and death. So considering Sharp's attention to the sea as a different kind of milieu, we might ask, in what ways is the ocean also an archive of breathlessness? Does our weather-making power as humans extend beyond our immediate habitat and sink into the sea? In an oceanographic sense, in the context of climate change, the answer is clearly yes. Even as terrestrial weathers heat up, life on land is spared an even harsher brunt of rising temperatures because of the sea's capacity to absorb this heat. This means that oceans are getting warmer, and rising ocean temperatures mean that the sea is also slowly suffocating. In the last 50 years, hypoxic conditions in the ocean have increased dramatically, and marine dead zones where oxygen is almost or totally depleted have quadrupled since half a century ago. Even small changes in sea temperatures dramatically affect the behavior, reproductive patterns, and movements of ocean creatures, which in turn affects ocean food webs and oxygen levels in the ocean. For phytoplankton, hotter water temperatures mean moving to different habitats, becoming smaller, and affecting an ability to soak up the carbon that we are pumping out. Simply put, all of our greenhouse gas-stoked and fossil-fueled desires are making the sea breathless too. We are weather makers even in the places our bodies do not and cannot belong. We still hold on to this idea, this mythical ocean, as an unfathomable elsewhere, a convenient dump for whatever we want to keep out of sight and out of mind. But ironically, the more we throw our discards overboard, the more they come back to haunt us as our weather making returns to us in multiple ways. Ocean photosynthesizers gift to humans every second breath we take, meaning that air breathers such as ourselves will also be profoundly affected by the suffocation of the seas. As we make the sea breathless, we are in turn deoxygenating ourselves. But nor is the weather underwater only a matter of materiality, of hypoxic zones or acidification. For in the wake and sinking to the sea floor, what we discover are not only spam cans or car tires or garbage islands or chemical traces or increased levels of carbon. We also discover, of course, the afterlife of the Middle Passage, the undersea of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Sharp points out that Black slaves who did not complete the crossing, whose bodies were thrown overboard into the Atlantic, are still present. Quote, because organisms eating organisms is the cycling of nutrients through the ocean, Sharp writes, the atoms of those people who were thrown overboard are out there in the ocean even today. In and as the bodies of benthic beings, these people are still in the wake. Sharp does not explicitly discuss this undersea afterlife as weather, but her work invites us to consider the relation of these dissolutions to the anthropogenic suffocation of the sea. For example, Sharp notes that, quote, the amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave the ocean is called residence time. And the sodium content in human blood suggests that it could have a residence time of 260 million years. Sharp continues, and what happens to the energy that is produced in the waters? It continues cycling like atoms in residence time. Sharp writes that we Black people exist in the residence time of the wake. And quoting Toni Morrison's Beloved, she points out that this is a time in which everything is now. It is all now. So with these concerns in mind, we want to enter the sea again, but this time diving into the wreck with Adrienne Rich. What will we find and what will we notice? So now we move to part 3, diving into the wreck. In her 1971 poem, Diving into the Wreck, white US lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich describes a speculative scene of underwater disaster. I came to explore the wreck, writes the poem's narrator, after they slip off the edge of a sun-drenched schooner. The diver's earthly body and its modes of inhabiting the world become redundant as the turquoise waters slowly turn dark and the narrator loses a terrestrially bound consciousness. The diver lacks the guidance they need to survey this new world. Unlike oceanographer Jacques Cousteau with his assiduous team, this diver notes that they are here alone. As they descend, they are alone. Finally, reaching the sunken wreck, illuminated with the beam of their torch, the diver discovers the, quote, half-destroyed instruments that once held to a course and the evidence of damage between the ribs of disaster. What kind of allegory is intended here? What does Rich's diver go in search of, and what do they discover? Commentary on Rich's poem from the time at which it was written mostly refers to the wreck as gendered systems of power, metaphorically evoking the submerged history of patriarchal oppression and its drowned victims, writes one critic. The wreck is said to index the wreck of obsolete myths, particularly myths about men and women. That was actually a critique of the poem written by Margaret Atwood in 1973. Yet reading the poem in our contemporary moment, where the climate emergency is itself the weather we inhabit, the poem's setting in the undersea implores a contemporary reader like me to perceive the wreck in and as the literal sea as well. After all, as Natasha Tinsley insists, instead of stripping theory of watery metaphors, quote, we should return to the materiality of water to make its metaphors mean more complexly. And I agree. So the question I want to turn to then is, how can we read Rich's weather underwater, how can we read Rich's poem today? while it may, as I argue below, offer us an interesting perspective on the weather underwater when it comes to the impending wreck of a multi-species ocean, and also connecting this to the gendered order of the Anthropocene, I want to know how it can respond to Sharp's idea of total weather, the anti-Blackness whose archive persists below the waves as residence time. So let's begin by further unpacking the poem, first as a kind of Anthropocene allegory about a climate-changing sea. We discover that even if we bring to Rich's work an anachronistic attention to the materiality of the sea, this focus is supported rather than contradicted by Rich's invocation of myth and the allegorical poem and mode in which the poem is written. After all, as we noted above in relation to the breathless sea, the ocean's mythical, endless capacity to wash away our sins as an other place is what has precipitated the current ecological crisis in the oceans. In our imaginary of the ocean as beyond space and time, we come to believe that we can relinquish what we no longer want to the depths of the seas, and that our spent desires will be ferried away to some unknown abyss, and that damage will never arrive. So when the diver in Adrian Rich's poem journeys to the benthos, they seek the wreck and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself and not the myth, as the poem says. So I wonder, might this myth then also be the idea that the sea is somehow immune from our material trespass? All of those anthropogenic wants are hardly gone, the diver discovers. They are instead lying, quote, obscurely inside barrels, half wedged and left to rot, the burden of their toxicity belied by the mermaid or the merman, whose, quote, breasts still bear the stress of that drowned cargo. Out of sight and out of mind, the deep becomes this banal sink for our capitalist consumerist desires, held in the form of pollution, rising sea temperatures, acidification. Increasingly breathless, the oceanic milieu is also then an archive of ecological wreckage. The irony of this mythic imaginary is that it is precisely the sea's capacity to hold onto our trash into a deep future that makes the ocean so vulnerable, and that makes us, dependent on the ocean's ability to breathe, vulnerable as well. So in all of these ways, one way to read Rich's poem is as a corroborating ethics, at least in part, of this idea of the weather underwater. There is indeed a wreck in and as the ocean wrought by our human hand. And I don't think this reading annuls or discredits a reading of the poem that suggests it's about gender. Indeed, the connection between a submerged history of patriarchal oppression and the ecological wreck of the sea is what Adrian Rich perhaps unwittingly invites us to consider. For instance, turning back to that mermaid/merman whose breasts still bear the stress of the wrecked cargo, we might consider how toxic incursions are unevenly distributed through planetary waters to other bodies in gendered ways. This includes the ways in which breast milk of some women is disproportionately contaminated by PCBs, either because their homes are sited alongside toxic industries or because contaminants biomagnify up through certain ocean food chains to be concentrated in the milk of new mothers. Or we might consider the buildup of environmental toxicants that come to reside in the placenta of a gestating female. We might also consider how the contamination of waterways intervene in the sex morphologies and reproductive capacities of humans and non-humans that live alongside water. Indeed, when Adrian Rich's diver claims, quote, "I am she, I am he," we can read this as an example of an affirmative transgender politics. But it's difficult not to also read this as evidence of how toxic waters lead to a sex-skewed birth rate and changing sex characteristics in fish, amphibians, and humans due to human-caused pollution. So, in other words, all of this reveals the way in which the domination of nature, and thus the contamination of oceans and other waters, is sustained by patriarchal capitalism. To return to the structure of analysis offered us by Christina Sharp, then, we come to understand the weather underwater as also tangled up with misogyny, gender normativity, and patriarchal control. And maybe this is the wreck that Adrienne Rich's diver discovers. But let's move on to part 4, the tentative haunters, and ask, how does this weather, where gendered power meets the archive of rotting desires at the bottom of the sea, how does this weather articulate with Sharp's critical insights into weather as anti-Blackness? To invoke the work of Sharp demands remaining attentive to that work's context and to Sharp's commitment to Black lives and life worlds that the work holds at its wet heart. On one reading of Adrienne Rich's poem, we might say it doesn't. Despite articulations with environmental justice concerns, there may be nothing in Rich's poem about Blackness. In fact, we could even parse Rich's diver as an avatar of white feminism, seeing her own gender oppression, but nothing else. The poem may even bring together a damaged gender order with a breathless sea, but without seeing what else is curving its assertion between the ribs of disaster. So I want to know, what else is there that this perhaps white feminist diver, or perhaps a certain reader of the poem, does not easily notice? Another way to think through this question would be to be attentive to the interstices of the poem, to its strange temporalities, its unanticipated meetings, its opening to different modes of embodied becoming. In the first place, although the diver explains their trepidation at, quote, having to do this here alone, when they reach the wreck of the benthos, they also marvel at what they find, slightly distracted by, quote, those many who have always been there. Put otherwise, perhaps the narrator's courageous descent into the benthos is interrupted by their blunt realization that many have been there before. Many have already taken this journey by choice or by necessity or by violence. We read, for example, that as they descend, the diver becomes distracted by the tentative haunters that move between the ribs of disaster. As a reader of the poem, we might become curious, who or what are those many that the diver discovers amidst the wreck? Those others that contradict the diver's own assertion that they are having to do this alone. On one reading, the salt and sway of crenellated fans between the reefs, as the poem says, may simply suggest scenes of siphonophores, mollusks, jellyfish, sessile anemones, a coffee table picture book image of the flourishing multi-species life of the sea. Maybe that's what Rich's diver encounters. Those many might just be a marine world that comprises the diver's other place and their otherwise. But I think this reading is problematic. First, if we understand Rich's wreck to be a kind of Anthropocene parable, then we have to reject an imaginary of the undersea as a mysterious and untouched elsewhere for those of us who are privileged enough to escape there. We have already established that the sea is not immune from anthropogenic weathers. So the idea that the ocean would still represent a place of otherworldly refuge of some kind of pure nature is precisely the myth that I want to interrupt. Those tentative haunters as a vibrancy of marine life have already long been changing in the breathless Anthropocene seas. And that's in part what the wreck is that the diver discovers. But secondly, I think, to imagine these various wreckages of the human as this kind of marine life is also problematic because it does this thing whereby we leap straight to the question of the animal, the non-human, the vegetable or the fungal or the microbial. And this is an impulse that I want to resist. As Black feminist philosopher Zakiya Jackson cautions, this appeal to move beyond the human, quote, may actually reintroduce the Eurocentric transcendentalism that this movement of, new materialism purports to disrupt, particularly with regard to the historical and ongoing distributive ordering of race, Jackson writes. So the move to see the undersea as a non-human, she might argue, is concomitantly, quote, an attempt to move beyond race and beyond the need for white scholarship to confront the racism within the heart of dominant versions of humanism that so many of us have been taught. So here, to move straight to understanding the tentative haunters in Rich's poem as otherworldly marine creatures might also be a way of bypassing the question of race and its insistent troubling of the human. After all, a consideration of more than human sea life is maybe more palatable and less threatening to whiteness than conceding the total climate of anti-Blackness that Sharp draws our attention to. If we want to consider the non-human, should we not learn in the first instance from the, quote, potentially transformative expressions of humanity that are cast out of the world and thus rendered inhuman, as Zakiya Jackson suggests? So how then might the disavowal that Jackson calls out be instead confronted and accounted for in Rich's poem, Diving into the Wreck? Recalling again this double gender of Rich's diver, I am she, I am he, we might take a first clue from the work of Horton Spillers, who argues that transatlantic slavery conversely entailed an ungendering of Africans by the Middle Passage, whose brutality turned their bodies into flesh, thus ejecting Black women from female subjecthood, writes Spillers. These bodies turned flesh were literally suspended in the oceanic, if, following Freud, we also understand this as an undifferentiated identity. That's a quote from Spillers as well. Prompted by Spillers' arguments, then, we might articulate this ungendered, this seared, divided, ripped apart flesh with Sharp's invocation of the atoms of those people who were thrown overboard, who are out there even today in the ocean. The residue of Black slaves who have morphed to persist in residence time of the sea. Might this residue also be what haunts the wreck that Adrienne Rich's diver discovers? So reading Sharp alongside Rich, we are called to consider that in their descent, the diver is not only witnessing the wreck of certain gendered social orders, nor are they only witnessing the breathless, wrecked ecological sea. They are also being asked to confront the weather of anti-Blackness that is still held by the ocean. These are the tentative haunters, the residue of anti-Blackness that the diver at first does not recognize as such. So my question then is, what happens when Rich's diver is invited to notice this weather? What kind of transformation could this open to? In other words, what else might curve in its assertion in the ribs of disaster? And now in the concluding section of this talk, I want to offer one final, more speculative reading of Adrienne Rich's poem. And this part is called An Invitation to Dissolution After and With the End of the World. In her descriptions of weather as all-pervasive anti-Blackness, Sharp also crucially insists that bodies, quote, produce out of the weather their own ecologies. In this way, they also resist the total climate. In the weather, writes Sharp, is disaster and possibility. While we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to the overwhelming force of the weather, we are not only known to ourselves and to each other by that force, writes Sharp. In other words, there is always something in excess of the weather. I wonder then, as both contaminated by the human as we know it in the white Anthropocene, at the same time as it gives rise to something excessive and unknowable, might the sea and the underwater weather help us live differently, in a different way, in different times? And if so, by what means? Here I draw on scholar Catherine Youssef's claim that insurgent language is what will counter Blackness's erasure through a poetry that cuts into coloniality as counter-aesthetic. That's from Youssef's book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. So perhaps one means to live differently in these times is via a poetic encounter in the depths of the undersea. Perhaps in such an encounter, Rich's diver might meet something else beyond the common readings of Rich's poem, beyond even the consideration that the wreck of the gendered order is also an environmental one, and maybe also a racialized one. For asserting itself in the wreckage is also, more specifically, a Black feminist aesthetic and poetics, something that has always been there, but which, for Rich's diver, perhaps went unnoticed. What if diving into the wreck, what Rich's diver meets is actually Afrofuturist lesbian feminist poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs, narrator from Gumbs's book, M. Archive, After the End of the World. Perhaps best described as a book-length work of poetry or a prose poem, Gumbs calls M. Archive a speculative documentary. It simultaneously evokes the history of the Middle Passage, the total weather of anti-Blackness, and the entanglement of environmental devastation with social justice, particularly in terms of gender and race. This book features a narrator archaeologist who, not unlike Rich's diver, looks back on the wreck of the world, sifting through its rubble to try to understand what precipitated and survived these end times. Through its torquing of a modern human relation to time, place, and matter, Gumbs's alter archive suggests that just as the devastation of the Anthropocene runs deeper than the contemporary environmental crisis, so have resistances to this devastation. So has beauty, survival, and quiet acts of ambivalence long been in the making. So in the book's long chapter on ocean, environmental and social justice are yoked together. Like Rich's diver who slips off the edge of the schooner, Gumbs's narrator archaeologist also ventures into the sea. Gumbs writes, quote, "She took a deep breath, pushed both empty hands forward and swam. Yet instead of threadbare disaster, Gumbs discovers possibility. This possibility is encountered in several ways, one of which is in the multitudes of life that still persist in the ocean archive because of and in spite of the weather. Gumbs's narrator refers to this multitude of depth beings, creatures who have always been there, ancestors who were also phytoplankton, dolphins, whales. These depth beings are shackles braided with coral, but also mermaids with muscled tails. They are possibilities because they are both different from and also part of the narrator herself. The depth beings are also, quote, ourselves, so melted and submerged in what we had done that we had to become deep. Through encountering these depth beings, the narrator is transformed. And part of this transformation includes learning to breathe differently. Quote, "We believed our lungs could breathe a totally different substance," she writes. As the narrator explores her new oceanic capabilities, quote, "She considered that maybe something was happening, like many sand cuts were turning into gills and the scales of her dried out skin were appropriate. She had a sense of herself one day soon being able to breathe through her whole body," end quote. So amidst this possibility, we notice so many reverberations with Rich's poem. Rich's unstable subjects, I am, you are, we are. Rich's poems, population with mermaids and the merman in his armored body, swaying marine life, an anachronistic memory. All of this makes for uncanny similarities between the two texts. Rich even reminds us that you breathe differently down here. So what are we to make of all these echoes? Well, we could just do a comparative reading. More radically, I want to suggest that these poems are happening simultaneously. Again, invoking Toni Morrison, everything is now. This speculation and this more speculative staging of the poems also underlines one of Gums's key premises in M Archive, which is the time-traveling function of Black poetics. Like Sharp reading Toni Morrison for the Poetics of Residence Time, where the past is also present, Gums's text invites the simultaneity of future times and our current moment. Linear time is scrambled as M Archive offers an opening to rethink completely the question of end times, which are both already here and never to arrive. In Gums's words, quote, "How can there be an end of the world if there is no linearity of time?" Importantly, this time travel is facilitated by the material properties of the sea. Underwater, the narrator claims, each drop is saying always, always, which is a homonym for right now, right now. Time travel, Gums moreover maintains, is a kind of fugitivity, a way of being otherwise while still being here. Unlike versions of fugitivity that suggest it's a kind of escape, fugitivity for Gums, in her homage to Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, comprises practices of care that can create communities of refuge and intergenerational intimacy. So if the weather is the total climate, even underwater, then learning to breathe is also about evolving new capacities to breathe. Fugitivity is about learning to breathe differently. There will always be weather underwater. We cannot escape the total climate. Indeed, white Anthropocene weathers wrench the possibility of fugitivity as some kind of escape to an elsewhere. But Pauline Gums demonstrates a different kind of fugitivity, a practice of building communities of refuge that is sustained by this Black feminist poetics, where breathing and time can be different. Time traveling, those breathing spaces can also be here and now. So now, if we understand that Rich is also there, and that Rich is with Gums below the waves, meeting each other, perhaps this is also an invitation to Rich to do or to relate or to be differently. As Alexis Pauline Gums affirms, M Archive is a site of crossing. The book, according to Gums, is generated out of a deep intimacy with the work of Jackie Alexander's Pedagogies of Crossing. And Gums describes her own text as an exploration of Alexander's proposition that we are always in the moment of crossing. M Archive is a way of seeking out new kinds of relation beyond what we live as now, but not as separate from that now. How are we related, Gums asks, beyond what we even understand our species to be right now? How are we related beyond what we understand to be our dominant relation to the planet? What if our relationships had to cross over that? How could we make sense of them? That's all a long quote from Gums. For Gums, and for those who must live in the total climate of anti-Blackness, M Archive is not a romantic thought experiment. It's an anagrammer of survival. But for Adrienne Rich's diver, who does not at first notice the anti-Blackness of the weather underwater, a different kind of crossing or transformation is necessary. So if we admit to the possibility of this simultaneous existence of the two poems, maybe we can understand Gums as extending this invitation to Rich's diver, and which is also an invitation to all feminisms and these more dominant versions of humanism more generally, an invitation to the possibility of different ways of relating, an invitation to cross, to become different, to dissolve current ways of weather making, and to notice the weather differently. For if in these climate changing times, we encounter not only rising sea levels and temperatures, but also pervasive anti-Blackness and misogyny and coloniality, we not only need to reimagine the weather, what it is and where it is, but some of us also need to become other than ourselves, other than the weather makers we currently are. And I think this is the invitation that Gums is extending to Rich. What happens if Rich's diver were to see the residue of slavery as part of the wreck they dive into? Maybe that wreck could also morph into or precipitate the wreck of a certain kind of human, or at least perhaps it could precipitate the partial dissolution of white colonial humanism that brought us to this crossing. Crossing requires new instruments and new ways of relating. We may not know what comes next. Maybe we will become a whale who gave up on terrestrial life 3 million years ago, returning to the deep as 5 fingers of a hand were slowly covered by a flipper. Maybe all of a sudden we will find that our feet are floating. Maybe like whales, as the seas rose around them, we will learn to notice by echolocation, a skill in which knowledge is utterly dependent on learning to listen differently. Maybe we will begin our own dissolution by breathing and learning and listening, by learning to help foster practices of fugitivity and care rather than only creating the weathers that necessitate them. Following generations of vibrant feminist and anti-racist scholarship, violence in the oceans cannot be a question of just add a gender perspective and stir, nor add a racial perspective and stir. Addressing the complex currents of anti-Blackness, misogyny, and environmental degradation that comprises the weather underwater will demand no less than that we become other than ourselves, and at least other than the human as we know it. To do so, we may need to untether ourselves and find ourselves at sea. To dissolve what we think we are and to learn to relate differently. We are crossing. And if this is to be mourned, it is also surely to be welcomed. And that's the end of the talk.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Professor Neimanis, for a wonderful talk. I now hand over to Professor Makoni to open the floor for discussion.
Thank you very much for this intriguing talk. I have a couple of issues that I would like you to help me think through. The first one is, how did you get interested in this area? If you were to write your own autobiography, how did you cross from wherever you were and finally got interested in this particular area? Then I will explain why I'm interested in the work that you do. But I want to know how you yourself crossed from, to use your own metaphor, from one area of study into what you are currently working on.
That is such a beautiful question, and I'm very grateful for it. So I was trained, as a PhD student, primarily in European philosophy and feminist philosophy. As an undergrad and a master's student, I read very widely across all different kinds and, transnational feminist philosophy, and it was very wide and very enriching. But then as I specialized in my PhD, there was this narrowing of a very sort of Eurocentric understanding of these ideas and a very humanist understanding of these ideas. And as somebody who's always been deeply connected to waters and oceans, I began to develop a theory of embodiment and feminist embodiment as understood through the water that comprises us all and that sustains us all as planetary beings. And so I started to look at waters and the oceans and rivers not as metaphoric vessels for understanding questions like flow or relation or leaking or connecting, but I wanted to understand those things very literally. And I wanted to understand how we are made up and related to each other through waters. At first, this idea was a very beautiful thought. It was very romantic and lovely. But of course, the more one understands what is happening to the oceans and the waterways that sustain us, it becomes a more fraught and troubling question of how we are polluting and contaminating waters and how we are connected through that. And then I want to say that my feminist training and my interest in feminist theory wanted me then to really think about how, if we're connected by waters, how does this not sort of, melt us all into one amorphous, ocean where difference is annihilated, but actually it channels difference and power and sort of violence in very specific ways, just as a river will find its course in very specific ways, picking up certain sediments and dropping them off, along the way. Ourselves as bodies of water that are connected, we channel this pollution of the planetary hydrocommons in ways that make it pool and collect in certain bodies while it sort of flows out of others. And so, thinking about bodies of water as also a mode of thinking about difference and thinking about colonial and gendered and racialized understandings of, and not just understandings, but materializations of power became where my work started to look. And so while I'd long been, in reference to this specific talk, I've always been really fascinated by this poem of Adrienne Rich, and I've been reading it for many years. And while the reading of it to me as a sort of Anthropocene allegory came quite quickly, trying to understand this poem as also, existing in a time of polarization that is also a very racialized moment in Western history. And that is, a continuation of a very long-standing history. I wanted to try to think this poem and these ideas is also a way to think about this question of, of white feminism, of Black Lives Matter, but in a way that wouldn't further entrench a polarization, but that might open up a moment of learning, well, for myself, learning to notice things differently. So noticing Christina Sharp's work within this poem for me was, a way to think about how can we cross over into different ways of being and relating by starting to understand these flows of water, these ocean repositories in ways that also collect histories that might not have been evident to us in the first place. And when I say us, I'm talking about myself and the sort of a very differentiated we that is, consistently moving through this poem. So that was a very long response, Sinfree. I'm sorry, but your question invited a little bit of reflection on how I get from one place to this paper. So I hope you indulge me.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So let me backtrack so that you can understand the context, the epistemological context from which I think I'm talking. I mean, as you know, in all these institutions that we are part of, we tend to be assigned to particular disciplines and areas of specialization and expertise. Why I'm interested in discussions about water, that arises from a deep dissatisfaction with the way theoretical linguists or applied linguists understand the nature of the practices of their own work. I'm not a conventional linguist, so what I say about language doesn't matter at all. But I think what I say about language, which is important, is the sense of disgruntlement with a discipline that I should know better. So my question to you is, as you go through your career and your analysis, you talked about how we should try and cross over. Isn't the efforts to try and cross over a very disorienting one as well? How do you balance this movement towards a future that is unknown? Because you need to cross over, like the way you put it is, we need to cross over. So it's no longer a question of coming up with alternative ways of being, of analysis. It's a question of us becoming something different. And how do you handle that process of becoming something different as you continue with your own intellectual trajectory?
Another beautiful and fascinating question. So it actually launches me into the territory of the talk that I was planning to, polish for today, and that I'm still thinking about. And so it's a question I'm thinking about a lot. And it's this idea of becoming untethered and being at sea.
Yes.
Right? And as we know, to be at sea is an idiom for, being discombobulated, this kind of idea of not having our bearings. We're sort of cast out and unable to anchor ourselves. And I 100% agree that this is a terrifying experience. It can be very confronting. But when I look at the world around us, and my apologies for being a little bit, my political sort of activist stripes begin to show, I look at the world around me and in these institutions and in this the city I live in, and I say, well, certainly the way we are now is not the way we are told we are to be now. There's always all of these resistances and different ways of being are there always, part of what I'm trying to identify in this talk. But unless we actually, those of us with power in different ways, let go and risk being at sea so that we may learn to dissolve some of those inherited understandings of what it means to be human, what it means to be in relation, and actually risk becoming otherwise, then we are bound to just keep circulating in this pond, this stagnant pond that does not risk the change that we desperately, both on, you know, in terms of ecological and environmental justice, but also in terms of, you know, social and gendered and racialized questions that we so desperately need to embrace. So I want to think about this, yes, as a terrifying moment, but also as a necessary one. To be at sea, to untether, can also be a way of letting go of the map, of the construct, of the structures that have led us to this place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I look towards the sea and some of these poetics that are, you know, circulating there in the work of so many writers I admire as a place of possibility. Yes, a little bit scary, but we all know that nothing significant ever changes unless we first are willing to enter a place of discomfort and the unknown, right? And again, I'm speaking that primarily referring to institutions and sort of places of power, you know, which is distributed in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, primarily it's about sort of those seats, whether that's a university or that's a government, or whether that's certain sort of orders of social power as they exist through economics and all sorts of other things, geographies. It's those sorts of seats of power that have to start to dissolve themselves a little bit. And as far as language goes, you know, I think, I mean, it's so interesting to me that you're a linguist, and I'm continually fascinated with language, which is also why I think that reading poetry and reading and thinking with poetry deeply is can be a very political sort of type of scholarship, because language is quintessentially that entity, that phenomenon that is both blatantly there in front of us, but that also has this deep, unknown sort of underside that keeps welling up and surprising us in ways that we never thought was expected. You know, I think poems are magic, like literal magic, because they can both say something very direct and very clear, and that at another time, in another context, say something completely differently. We can find things in them that are, you know, never at the surface. So, so again, a long response to your very intriguing question.
So the long and short of this, from the perspective of linguists, might be that we are likely to be more enriched if we do more analysis of poetry. Let me give you a tongue-in-cheek response to this. When you were talking, and you were, what was going through my mind was how you were able to capture the issues about protests. I mean, whether using Fanon, some of the Black Lives Matter issues and all that. And the interesting thing about it is, together with my other two colleagues, Ashraf and Christine, we've just finished 2 volumes called The Sociolinguistics of Protest. And when you finished your conversation, your presentation, I said to myself, I wish she had presented this before we submitted our material to the editors, because what was striking about where you did your presentation was how to move from a discussion of poetry. You went through Frantz Fanon, you went through these various texts, and you were navigating your way through to the oceans, and at the same time come up with this ensemble of scholarship. So just the sheer trip that you took us on was a protest against what Ashraf would call a linearity of text, right? And unfortunately, as you know, I mean, you only get to know more about these ideas when the books are with the publishers. Right.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it reminds me very much of what, before we began the talk and we were in the waiting room, and Anissa, you were speaking about, the metaphor of the river as a metaphor for life. I have to say that thinking so deeply and materially with waters and various kinds of waters through my own academic trajectory has taught me that this is the way that I like to think. I've sort of tried to think like, instead of, thinking as a container or as a box of ideas, what if instead I let my thinking and scholarship and research move more like water, picking up ideas, bringing them to other contexts, other questions, other disciplines, and seeing what happens as those streams move through, gather, and collect each other. It's very much a method that I have brought to my now very interdisciplinary scholarship. If I started much more as a philosophical thinker, I'm now like, I've totally perforated that sort of discipline and tried to let those ideas flow through the world and through different realms of scholarship and ideas and concepts to see what new kinds of ideas or pathways might be charted. So this kind of non-linearity of the text is also for me a method of thinking.
Good. Thank you very much. Let me hand over to Chanel and then bring in some of our other colleagues, and then depending on how it goes, I may come back again. Thank you very much. Chanel.
Thank you. I have a question by Cecile, who asks, I wonder to what extent the call to let go is not coming from a place of privilege and therefore may fail to address the deep inequalities that plague millions of people around the world. Not everybody can even start thinking about letting go.
Yeah, Cecile, thank you so much for that question, 100%. And I think that's why, although I had to shorten this talk somewhat to fit into the time, I'm very interested in writing from a relatively situated position, as somebody who, as a university professor, as somebody who lives in a relatively secure position, although, well, it is a place of privilege. And this talk, I actually wanted to, and in the longer version of the talk, I actually wanted to take on the question of what it means to try to write and address and account for that privilege to some extent. It has to be done all the time and in multiple ways. And it's certainly not going to happen in the confines of just one talk. But instead of sort of writing abstractly, actually think from this place, think from a place of Adrian Rich's diver, who also is diving into this wreck, sort of almost as a choice. What does that mean? And how others, and those that Adrian Rich's diver encounters in the depths of the sea, are not there necessarily by choice, but through acts of unspeakable violence. So there is this sense that to think about letting go or crossing or being at sea, what I want to try to think as well is to think about the different situations in which one comes to be at sea and what that asks of each of us. So to be at sea for me may mean this crossing, this letting go, this taking this step to dissolve a certain inheritance that I've come into, as a subject. But being at sea for others means something very, very different. And how can we try to hold these various understandings of being at sea together in a confluence of waters where we are in the same milieu, but situated within it very differently? And here I'm also taking a cue from the work of Max Liboiron, who is an environmental scientist, but who some of you may know their work. They wrote a book called Pollution is Colonialism last year. And one of the things they say in that book is, well, sometimes we, speak as we because it's expedient in the situation. How do we situate our scholarship in ways that we are always thinking about our specific obligations to a place or to an idea or to a concept? So part of this talk is me sort of trying to think about my specific obligations to this idea of being at sea. Somebody who would like to imagine they are thinking and working in solidarity with many others, but who does, come from a very specific kind of situation. And again, I think this is, one of the very troubling inheritances of a lot of institutional university scholarship that some of us will have inherited, is this idea of the scholar as the abstract or universal voice that is just does not let us get into the crevices and the corners and the crannies that we really have to sort of dislodge some of that in order to understand and account for where it is that we speak for and from as scholars. So that to be at sea is one that I want to own that understanding of it, and certainly not something I would ask of all. It just briefly, if I can also say, this relates to a sort of another body of work that I've been working on for about 6 years, more specifically on the weather. And, the beginning of my talk where I brought in, Christina Sharp's idea of the weather is part of this whole other work I've been doing on weather, where myself and my colleague, Jennifer Hamilton, have been trying to understand this idea of weathering and thinking it through a politics of shelter and vulnerability, where what we want to try to call for is not for everyone to be more exposed to the weather, nor for everyone to be like totally protected, because, on the one hand, vulnerability is not romantic, but there are plenty of people in the rich Western world who could use maybe a little less of 3 cars, air conditioning, jet planes. So instead, we want to think about weathering as a redistribution of shelter and vulnerability. It's not to make everyone vulnerable or everyone completely sheltered, but think about how do we redistribute both shelter and vulnerability so that we can all enjoy adequate shelter and also be sort of pulling, I can't help but think about people like Elon Musk and that sort of character, like they don't need more shelter, they need something else. So I appreciate your question. And so I suppose to sum it up, I would say that this call to let go or to be at sea or to be untethered would also need to be thought with a similar understanding of redistribution of the vulnerability that is entailed in the idea of being at sea. Thank you for that really good question.
Thank you so much. Cecile, did you want to respond, or is it? Okay. There are no questions currently in the chat box or any hands that I see. So if anyone wants to jump in, you are more than welcome to. Let me see. I see one from Christine. Thank you so much, Christine. She says, lovely discussion. Thanks a lot, Astrida. Following Cecile, how do you cope with the sea currents that may take us again and again to the very same place? How can we balance taking hold of the navigation and letting it go? Or do we just let it go because deep inside there is a sort of confidence? If so, confidence into what?
This is another beautiful question. I mean, I'm just grateful for the image that it evokes. And I don't have an immediate answer because I don't know if I've thought this particular question, but if I could just say that, when such a question occurs to me or is posed to me, my instinct is always to, as somebody trained in phenomenology, my instinct is to go back to the thing itself then. So what does happen when sea currents, keep circling, taking us to the same place over and over again? What are the actual material, physical, chemical, oceanographic events that are happening in that instance? And one thing about sea currents is that without the movement of currents, life in the oceans could not exist, right? We think about the ocean as perhaps just like water, and in a Western sort of ontology, things are generally static. But of course, the ocean is the ocean because it is constantly moving. Tidal pulls, currents, upwellings, downfallings. It is only because of these movements that life can be sustained. It is only because of the currents that certain nutrients are brought from the deep sea back to shore, down and up. It's these currents, although they may look like they are a repetition, a bare repetition, as Gilles Deleuze might say, they are actually this kind of difference and repetition. Each time the current comes, it's bringing something new, it's renewing something, it's taking something away. That sort of renewal and redistribution is happening at levels maybe beyond or beneath our sort of bare understanding of this, back in the same place, back in the same place. But there is this renewal happening. So I would want to think your question by paying attention to those subtle transformations that are happening with that sea current. What is actually being renewed each time that same thing goes around? So maybe my instinct would be let go, because the confidence would be in the fact that the ocean is constant in its movements. Even though it may seem repetitive, it is constantly engaging in an act of renewal, bringing us something new, bringing new nutrients or tools or ideas to us at the same time as it's washing something away. That's how I would want to think that question.
Christine, would you like to respond? Okay. Prof. Marco, I have one question from Khadija.
Hello, everyone.
Hi,
hi, Mr. Marconi. So, it was very beautiful. I came a little bit late, but I just have one question. I'm sorry if it sounds rude or something. I don't know how to actually articulate it. So, okay. As a white woman, did you receive critics like your point of view is a little bit romantic and optimist?
What
oh no, did we lose Khadija?
I think we might have lost Khadija.
Oh no.
Okay.
Always lose Khadija at some point. She always comes back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm at Mozilla at the moment, so let's see.
There. You're back, Khadija. So we lost you. We lost you right at the moment where you were saying that as a white woman, have I received critiques of this work as being romantic? And I wonder if you want, you're muted still, but do you want to continue that question? You're muted, Khadija.
Khadija, on t'entend pas. On ne t'entend pas. Ton micro est fermé.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just talking. I'm sorry. Pardon.
Thank you.
So I was telling that. Did you receive sometimes some backlash about the fact that you are a white woman, and the fact that maybe you can sound a little bit too optimist and romantic about the thing of letting go and all the stuff around the ocean movement, the fact that it brings something new? I don't know if you get my point. Like, that was my question. If you have some critics about it.
No, thank you so much, Khadija. It's a really good question, and I wish more people would ask me questions like this. I think it's brave to to do it, and it's really I really appreciate it. I think what your question does is again, not sort of just jump over these difficult politics, but it asks me to account for them. And I will say 100% that this piece of work, particularly that engages with Sharp's work and Alexis Pauline Gumbs's work, made me a bit nervous. It's like I'm getting into territory that is political, and that is in polite academic circles, we just sometimes don't always talk about. And so part of my hope in writing this paper was that I would get questions like this. I want to talk about these issues. And I want to ask what someone like me, who is a white woman, who would like to believe that I have an intersectional consciousness and understanding of feminism, is nonetheless, not always seeing things, not always noticing, the situation of others. So part of this paper was, for me, a way to look at that square in the eye and see what would happen. I think the end is a bit romantic. I actually don't have to let go of anything right now if I don't want to. I think climate change, which is a leveler in some respects, of course, the effects of climate change are still very unevenly distributed, but there will be very few of us that are spared entirely from its effects. So I think partly one of the reasons I want to think about ecological crisis and catastrophe alongside other questions of social and racial and gender justice are because of the ways that in an environmental catastrophic context, we do all have to let go. We will be made to let go in one way or the other. And maybe that's a rehearsal for this letting go we should have been doing all along, and we, again, I'm speaking about me. So I don't think I have the answers to your question entirely. I think that I'm very, drawn to the work of people like Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who does suggest for me a place of crossing, a place of meeting, a place of dissolution, a place of joy and beauty, even in disaster, So I want to think more about what my obligation is to think about beauty and joy, but as somebody to whom it is not such a luxury, or what I mean is I've enjoyed that luxury perhaps more than others already, So yeah, the very short answer to your question is yes, it does feel a bit romantic. And I'm glad that I have this critique, and it pushes me to keep thinking more deeply with this question and about how to not do the thing where, I pretend nothing is happening outside my own world, but nor do I naively open it up and say, everything is fine, we're all one big family, but to keep thinking about intellectual and scholarly projects that can help us navigate and account for these differences. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Khadija. Okay, before I get to Scott, there's a comment by Teresa who is asking something that I've also been thinking about while Prof. Neimanis was speaking, and she says, intriguing and thought-provoking. Makes me think of migrations, human and animals that are prevented, obstructed by borders, politics, flows of movements, colonized into stasis. This is more of a comment, Prof. Neimanis, but did you want to respond to that?
Yes, and it's one of the questions that when I as I move to develop this project of being at sea, is a particular question I want to look at more directly, which is migration, and also climate migration, in terms of human populations, but also in terms of non-human populations. What do we know? Again, if we go back to the thing itself, we know that we can make borders and put up walls, fences, dig, channels that try to prevent movement across. But ultimately, those are generally failures, right? Things move or perish trying. I don't want to romanticize that either. So it is, yeah, I mean, I guess I want to agree with the comment that is something that we need to think of. I would like to think about more. And again, I guess I want to sort of poke at the last part of your comment, where certain, human or animal entities are colonized into stasis. Like the stasis never wins. It's just at what cost? At what cost? And so, the nice romantic answer is, let's dismantle the borders. At the same time, borders and boundaries are necessary. Like I need the boundary of my skin, my human skin, to keep me from melting all over the desk in front of me. Like there are things that keep bodies of water separate from each other that are very, very helpful, No, otherwise we're all just one amorphous mass. But this kind of border that I think you're talking about, this boundary that is not just a porous membrane, but that tries to remove the porosity, that tries to remove the sort of movement flow through that all borders really need. That's when we get into a problem, because water will always, any body of water, human, animal, river, will always transgress that border, either by destroying it, by going under it, by evaporating into the air, by going into the ground. Something will happen. So what I think your comment is really, again, putting on the table the need for us in, the current state of the world of, and a reinforcement of border politics is, to keep working to rethink and dismantle that. At the same time, as that doesn't mean it's like, let's just flood everything. It's like, how do we hold on to porous membranes that do important work, right? Here, maybe I just want to briefly say, I've been reading a lot of trans scholarship lately within gender studies. There's a great new book by someone named Cleo Wolfley-Hazard called Underflows, and it's queer, feminist, trans scholarship on river politics and river restoration and ecological conservation of rivers. And one of the things that Cleo keeps saying in this book, drawing on the work of many other trans scholars, is, trans means to cross over. It doesn't mean like you're moving to a definite destination. It means that you're curious about borders and the work that they do, So I think like, it's not that I want to be a proponent for like anti-border or anti-membrane. Borders are useful in all sorts of ways. It's just that we have come to rely on them as this definite thing that must be put into place to prevent the crossing that is required. That's the problem. So I think trans scholarship has a lot to teach us about the work of borders and about crossing over. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, Scott, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chanel, and thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. I think I'm finally starting to understand a bit better why water ontologies or epistemologies, are not necessarily depoliticizing or kind of how they can be, really, really politically potent ways of thinking about the world. So thank you very much for that. I've got sort of two questions. The second one's a small one, but the first one is in line with this idea of kind of politicizing the letting go and thinking about what kind of action, what kind of things we can do materially. I personally find the work of Olufemi Taiwo, who has sort of theorized climate, patriarchy, and racial capitalism as global systems, not just sort of on the Middle Passage, but sort of a global picture of where we are today because of racial capitalism and patriarchy, and all of the effects it's had on the world, and why that makes the argument for a global system of reparations and giving land back, etc., the only sort of real politics, he argues, that can deal with climate change, that can actually, create the world we want to live in. So that sort of eco-socialist vision, I think, is very powerful. So my first question is whether you've engaged with those ideas, and whether you think that might be a way to kind of connect to a particular program or to a way of thinking about these things. But my second question is just really a small one. I was fascinated because I was Googling Alexis Pauline Gumbs while you were talking. I hadn't engaged with her work before. And you, of course, you were writing your talk before the pandemic, as you said. She released a book, which I found during the pandemic, called Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. And there, right at the beginning, because I was just browsing the intro, she talks about echolocation. And kind of echolocation as this way of thinking about also connecting with other people. So I was just wondering if your mention of echolocation and your conclusion has something to do with an ongoing engagement with Gums's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. So the answer to your questions are like yes and yes. The eco-socialist vision, in Olufemi's work is pretty new to me. I've just started reading this work in the last year, and I haven't written with it yet, but I thank you for, again, pointing that out, because I'd like to look at it more deeply. I certainly agree, and as other scholars, ones that I'm more familiar with in anti-colonial and decolonial scholarship, who have been writing that this vision of land back, global reparations is the response to climate change, and really the only one, as you put it. I'm very much in line with that view, and I'm going to, I'd like to think about that a little bit more deeply, specifically in relation to that work. So thanks for that. And Alexis Pauline Gumbs's work, yes, I mean, it's kind of this little miraculous thing that happens when you discover a writer, sort of early at the stages of their career. Like Alexis Pauline Gumbs's wrote this trilogy. The first book was about Hortense Spillers, the second was about Jackie Alexander, and the third about Sylvia Wynter. And it didn't, it didn't, as far as I could see within my own sort of feminist theory sort of circles, didn't get picked up that much. But I found it, and I was so enamored by it, and started writing with it and reading it. And it just was completely not only articulating ideas that I had been thinking about for a long time, but was like giving it this language, this poetic language that was really inspiring to me. And then, seeing this new book of hers, Undrowned, and its a connection to marine mammals, which is actually written in it's a more accessible book in many ways, in its language, and it's become quite popular, and at least on my Instagram account. I'm very much enjoying that sort of, although I've never met Alexis Pauline Gumbs, sort of being in this sort of long conversation, an ongoing one, with her work. I think I may get to meet her later this year. No, not this year, next year. So yes, thanks for both of those references. And there was one thing I wanted to say about your first longer question. No, just that one other thing that I found in that work that I think I wanted to sort of delve into more deeply around this politicization of the letting go is that there's something in that work that I like, that it's not about identity, right? And this is also what I really so much like about like Christina Sharp's work. It's the sort of the political responses and analyses are not about identity, but about structures and historical structures, right? And material instantiations of things. So, so that is something that I think is very useful and very a way to start thinking beyond or more deeply into some of the polarizing moments we're seeing around so many political questions right now. It's about like dismantling structures that are real about, you know, reparations, about land, about, you know, these historical things, rather than like who you are, you know, that let's stick with the structures and who they've, you know, and thinking with water has also been that sort of invitation to me to think about how these forces of power travel and where they accumulate, less about, you know, some sort of essentialist understanding of identity. And I think Olufemi Temi's work also is useful in this way.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have come to the end of our formal session. I will now give over to Professor Makoni just to give the final words, and then we can give over to, I think, Vishnya to let us know who our next speaker will be.